Ethan Mercer had never imagined that the morning he lost his job would become the first page of a story people would one day argue about in business schools, documentaries, and biographies, because at that moment he was standing in the lobby of a gray office tower holding a cardboard box with a coffee mug, a fading family photograph, and a laptop that no longer belonged to him, while streams of employees hurried past pretending not to notice the man security had politely escorted to the elevators only minutes earlier. He looked at the city outside through the revolving glass doors, watching buses spray rainwater across the sidewalks as if the weather itself had decided to erase every plan he had carefully assembled over the previous 10 years. His phone vibrated with a message from his younger sister, Lily. "Dinner tonight? Mom keeps asking about you." He stared at the screen for several seconds before typing back, "Sure. I'll be there." He deliberately omitted the news because he wanted at least a few more hours before becoming another unemployed man surrounded by sympathetic expressions. Instead of heading home, he wandered through streets filled with restaurants opening for lunch, delivery riders weaving between taxis, construction cranes swinging overhead like giant mechanical birds, and digital billboards advertising luxury watches that cost more than he had left in his savings account. The city suddenly looked different to him. It was no longer simply a place where he worked. It was a battlefield where every building represented someone else's victory. By late afternoon he reached a quiet riverside park and sat on a weathered bench where an elderly man was feeding pigeons with remarkable patience. "You look like someone who expected life to negotiate," the old man said without turning his head. Ethan laughed despite himself. "Does it show that clearly?" "Only to people who have already made the same mistake." Ethan shrugged. "Lost my job today." "Then congratulations." Ethan frowned. "That seems like an unusual response." The man smiled. "Most cages come with salaries." Before Ethan could ask another question, the old man stood, emptied the remaining crumbs onto the pavement, and walked away without introducing himself, leaving Ethan strangely unsettled by a conversation that had lasted less than 2 minutes. That evening his mother's apartment smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. Family photographs covered nearly every wall, preserving happier versions of everyone around the dinner table. His mother immediately noticed something was wrong. "You smile with your mouth but not your eyes," she said quietly while serving food. Ethan sighed. "The company downsized today." Silence settled over the room until Lily finally reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Then they lost someone useful." His mother nodded. "Your father rebuilt his business twice before he died. Don't confuse a closed door with the end of the road." Ethan appreciated their faith, yet he also knew neither of them understood the size of his fear. His mortgage payments would not disappear because of encouraging words. Bills had no interest in optimism. During the following weeks he attended interviews that all ended similarly. Recruiters praised his experience, complimented his professionalism, and eventually informed him they had selected another candidate. Every rejection chipped away at his confidence until even introducing himself felt like advertising a product nobody wanted to buy. One rainy afternoon he ducked into a neighborhood cafe to escape the weather. The owner, a cheerful woman named Sophia, apologized because the internet had failed again, forcing several frustrated customers to leave. Ethan glanced toward the tangled collection of routers behind the counter. "Mind if I take a look?" Within 20 minutes he had identified a simple configuration error and restored the connection. The entire cafe erupted in relieved applause from students, freelancers, and remote workers whose laptops immediately reconnected. Sophia refused to let him pay for his coffee. "You saved my busiest afternoon this week." Ethan smiled. "It wasn't a big deal." "Maybe not for you," she replied, "but small problems become expensive when nobody knows how to solve them." Her sentence lingered in his thoughts long after he left. That evening he opened his laptop and began researching thousands of small businesses. Again and again he discovered the same pattern. Restaurants struggled with outdated software. Local stores wasted money on inefficient inventory systems. Family-owned companies lacked affordable technology support because consulting firms focused on large corporate clients. By sunrise Ethan had filled an entire notebook with observations. Instead of chasing another employer, perhaps he could solve problems independently. The idea felt reckless. He possessed only enough savings to survive 6 months if he spent carefully. Starting a business under those circumstances seemed almost irresponsible, yet every practical alternative appeared to be disappearing. 2 days later he printed inexpensive business cards bearing the words Mercer Solutions, technology that works for small business. He disliked the logo, questioned the name, and knew almost nobody would take him seriously, but he carried the cards anyway. His first month was brutal. He walked door to door introducing himself to skeptical owners who had heard countless promises from salespeople. Some politely declined. Others interrupted before he finished his first sentence. One bakery owner laughed outright. "You expect me to trust my computers to a man carrying flyers in the rain?" Ethan pocketed the rejection without arguing. He had already learned that wounded pride consumed energy better invested elsewhere. His first paying client came unexpectedly when Sophia recommended him to a florist whose payment system repeatedly crashed during holiday rushes. Ethan spent 16 exhausting hours rebuilding the entire setup, sleeping briefly on a chair while software updates installed overnight. When the store opened the next morning, every register functioned flawlessly. The florist insisted on paying double the agreed amount. "You saved Valentine's Day," she said. "I thought we'd lose everything." More importantly, she told every neighboring shop about him. Recommendations spread slowly at first and then with surprising momentum. Within 4 months Ethan could barely keep up with appointments. He hired his first employee, a recent college graduate named Marcus, whose technical skills were average but whose curiosity was extraordinary. During the interview Marcus admitted, "I don't know everything." Ethan answered, "Good. People who think they know everything stop learning." Together they spent long days repairing networks, building custom software, and solving increasingly complicated challenges. Yet success created a new problem. They were trading hours for money. Every additional client demanded more time, more travel, and more employees. One evening Marcus stared at a whiteboard filled with schedules. "We're becoming busier, not bigger." Ethan nodded slowly. "Exactly. So what's the difference?" Marcus asked. Ethan uncapped a marker and drew 2 circles. Busy means working harder. Bigger means building something that keeps working even when we're asleep. That conversation changed the direction of the company. Instead of selling only consulting services, they began designing affordable cloud-based management software specifically for independent businesses. Investors ignored them. Banks rejected loan applications. Established competitors dismissed the concept as too narrow to matter. To finance development, Ethan sold his car, refinanced his apartment, and accepted months of financial uncertainty that kept him awake long after midnight. Lily worried openly. "You're risking everything." Ethan answered honestly. "If I stop now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering whether fear made my decisions." Development proved far more difficult than expected. Software bugs appeared faster than they could eliminate them. A key programmer accepted another job without warning. Their office ceiling leaked during storms, forcing them to place buckets between desks while employees joked that the company was pioneering aquatic software engineering. Morale fluctuated wildly. Some mornings optimism filled every conversation. Other afternoons silence dominated because another deadline had slipped away. Then, just as their remaining cash could barely cover payroll for another month, a national chain of independent grocery cooperatives agreed to test their platform across 20 stores. The pilot represented either salvation or disaster. If the system failed, word would spread quickly. If it succeeded, everything could change. The launch week unfolded like a nightmare. Unexpected traffic overwhelmed servers. Inventory numbers duplicated randomly. One manager accidentally ordered 5,000 cartons of orange juice because of a synchronization error. Ethan personally drove through the night to reassure furious clients while Marcus coordinated emergency fixes from the office. Nobody slept more than 2 hours at a time. On the 4th day, an exhausted cashier called Ethan over. "Look," she whispered, pointing at the checkout screen. Every transaction was processing perfectly. Inventory updated instantly. Delivery schedules synchronized automatically. By the end of the week, operating costs had dropped significantly across every participating store. Managers who had begun the trial expecting failure now requested long-term contracts. News traveled rapidly through industry associations. Orders multiplied faster than the small company could comfortably handle. Venture capital firms that had ignored Ethan months earlier suddenly requested meetings in expensive conference rooms overlooking the skyline. During one presentation, an investor leaned back and asked, "What's your exit strategy?" Ethan answered without hesitation, "I don't want to exit. I want to build infrastructure businesses depend on every day." Several investors exchanged amused glances, assuming youthful ambition would eventually yield to financial temptation. One of them, however, remained silent until everyone else had finished speaking. Her name was Victoria Chen, founder of an investment group known for backing unconventional entrepreneurs. After the meeting, she caught Ethan in the hallway. "Everyone else asked how quickly they could make money from you," she said. "I want to know how quickly you can outgrow them." Ethan studied her expression carefully. "Why would you ask that?" "Because industries rarely change because of the largest companies. They change because someone underestimated refuses to stay small." Their partnership transformed Mercer Solutions almost overnight. Fresh capital allowed the company to hire elite engineers, expand internationally, and strengthen cybersecurity before larger competitors recognized the threat. Ethan suddenly found himself flying between countries, negotiating contracts in unfamiliar cities, speaking at technology conferences, and adapting to a world where every decision affected thousands of employees rather than only himself. Yet with rapid growth came attention from rivals who had previously dismissed him. One multinational corporation launched a nearly identical product at a dramatically lower price, sacrificing profits to drive Mercer Solutions out of the market. Headlines questioned whether Ethan's company could survive the assault. Employees nervously watched customer numbers each morning. Marcus entered Ethan's office carrying a stack of reports. "If this continues for 6 months, they'll bleed us dry." Ethan remained surprisingly calm. He walked to the window overlooking hundreds of employees working below. "They're trying to win the wrong war." Marcus frowned. "Meaning?" Ethan smiled faintly. "They think this is about software." "It isn't. It's about trust, and trust can't be discounted like a product." Instead of lowering prices, Ethan announced free training programs, 24-hour customer support, and personalized business consulting for every client regardless of size. Competitors offered cheaper software. Mercer Solutions offered confidence. Small business owners noticed the difference immediately. Customer loyalty strengthened while the multinational company quietly abandoned its price war after suffering massive losses. Journalists celebrated Ethan as an unlikely business visionary, but he privately knew victory had depended on something less glamorous than genius. He had simply remembered how frightened he himself had once been as a small business owner searching for someone willing to solve problems instead of merely selling products. One evening, after returning from an international conference where hundreds of entrepreneurs had applauded his keynote speech, Ethan visited the same riverside park where years earlier an elderly stranger had congratulated him on losing his job. The bench remained exactly where he remembered it. As he sat watching the river shimmer beneath the setting sun, a familiar voice behind him said, "So, did you finally discover what the cage was keeping you from?" Ethan slowly turned, astonished to see the same old man standing there with a paper bag full of bread for the pigeons, smiling as though only a single afternoon. Rather than the digital networks currently experiencing instability. Marcus examined the controls. "This technology is strange." Ethan looked over. "How?" "It's advanced and outdated at the same time." Marcus pointed toward the navigation equipment. "No connection to external networks. No satellite dependence. No automatic updates. Your father built it to function without the world." Elena answered from the rear compartment. "That was the entire philosophy." Ethan turned toward her. "Explain." "Modern systems became powerful because they connected everything. Your father believed resilience required knowing when to disconnect. The submarine traveled for nearly 3 hours before reaching a hidden coastal cave several hundred kilometers from the island. The exit led into an abandoned fishing facility that appeared untouched by modern development. Rusted equipment lined the docks. Empty warehouses stood beneath a gray sky. Yet hidden beneath the floor was another smaller research station containing communication equipment, emergency supplies, and physical copies of Project Looking Glass data. Ethan stared at the shelves. How many locations like this exist? Elena looked away. Not many. How many? She hesitated. 7. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And you've known about them? I knew some existed. Why didn't you tell us? Elena met his gaze. Because knowing where something is doesn't mean knowing who controls it. Before the conversation could continue, every screen in the station activated. A live broadcast appeared. The face on the screen was familiar. Adrian Wells. Ethan immediately stepped closer. Adrian looked exhausted but unharmed. He sat in a plain room with concrete walls. A small camera faced him. Ethan, Adrian said, if you're seeing this, they want you to believe I'm responsible. Ethan watched silently. Adrian continued. I need you to understand something. The evidence against me is real. Victoria frowned. What? Adrian looked directly into the camera. I don't mean fabricated evidence. I mean they used my actual credentials. Marcus stepped closer. How? Adrian continued. Because 3 years ago I discovered someone had been creating secondary versions of executives inside corporate systems. Not fake people. Shadow profiles. Complete histories attached to real identities. Ethan felt a chill. Why didn't you tell anyone? Adrian laughed bitterly. I tried. The screen changed briefly, showing an old report marked confidential. Every time I raised concerns, the issue disappeared. Reviews were closed. Investigations found nothing. Eventually I assumed I was wrong. Ethan watched Adrian carefully. Why contact me now? Adrian looked toward the camera. Because the system they built doesn't need people to betray each other anymore. It only needs us to distrust ourselves. The broadcast ended abruptly. Marcus immediately began tracing the source. It's gone. Ethan looked at Elena. Who released that? She answered quietly. Maybe Adrian. Maybe? Or maybe someone wanted you to hear it. Ethan disliked that answer because it was becoming increasingly common. Every message seemed to contain both truth and manipulation. The world they were navigating had become one where even accurate information could serve hidden purposes. That afternoon they established contact with the International Council. The response was chaotic. Some governments supported Ethan's approach. Others demanded he surrender access to the predictive system immediately. A few accused him of attempting to create the very centralized authority he had warned against. The criticism bothered Ethan because he recognized the danger. He had spent months fighting against hidden control, yet now circumstances had placed him near the center of a system capable of influencing billions. The difference between protection and domination could become dangerously small. Marcus noticed Ethan's hesitation during a private conversation. You're thinking about walking away. Ethan looked surprised. How did you know? Because you keep asking whether. You have the right to make decisions. Ethan leaned against the wall. Shouldn't I ask that? Yes. Marcus paused. But don't confuse humility with surrender. Ethan looked at him. Meaning? The people who caused this crisis are counting on responsible people stepping aside because they're afraid of becoming responsible for mistakes. Ethan considered that carefully. Marcus continued. Someone will make decisions. The question is whether those decisions come from people who admit uncertainty or people who pretend they don't have any. That evening Elena requested a private conversation. She led Ethan to the edge of the abandoned harbor where waves moved gently beneath the fading sunset. "You don't trust me," she said. Ethan did not deny it. "Should I?" "No." The answer surprised him. Elena looked toward the horizon. "Trust is earned through actions, not explanations." Ethan studied her. "Then why are you helping us?" She remained silent for several seconds. "Because your father was my friend." "Only that?" Elena looked down. "No." The admission came quietly. "He was the person who convinced me that intelligence without compassion was simply another form of ignorance." Ethan waited. "What happened between you?" "We disagreed." "About the system?" She nodded. "Samuel wanted to abandon the project entirely. I believed the work was too important to destroy." We argued for months. "And who was right?" Elena smiled sadly. "Neither of us." She picked up a small stone and threw it into the water. "He was right that the system could become dangerous. I was right that the problems it was designed to solve were real." We spent years fighting over whether a tool was good or bad while ignoring the question of who would guide it. Ethan thought about his own company. The same mistake had nearly happened there. Building powerful tools without building equally strong principles. "Why didn't you destroy it?" he asked. Elena answered immediately. "Because your father left one final safeguard." Ethan looked at her. "The human participation layer?" "No." She shook her head. "Something before that." She reached into her coat and removed a small object. It was an old recording device, worn and scratched from decades of use. "He left a message." Ethan stared at it. "For whom?" Elena pressed the button. Static filled the air. Then Samuel Mercer's voice emerged. Older. More tired than the recordings Ethan had heard before. "If you are hearing this, then the system has survived longer than I expected." Ethan listened closely. "There is one final principle I could not encode mathematically. It is the only thing a machine cannot discover by itself." The recording paused briefly. "A prediction is only useful if the person receiving it remains free to reject it." Ethan felt the significance immediately. Samuel continued. "Any system that makes obedience the price of survival is not saving humanity. It is replacing it." The recording ended. Elena put the device away. That was the final safeguard. Ethan shook his head slowly. "A sentence?" "A principle." She looked toward the harbor. "Your father believed the greatest protection against misuse was not stronger security. It was preserving the ability to disagree." The next morning Ethan made a decision that shocked nearly everyone involved. Instead of hiding the predictive system or placing it under government control, he announced that the entire architecture would be released to the public under strict conditions. Researchers, universities, governments, businesses, and communities would be able to inspect the system, challenge its predictions, and build alternatives. Several advisors called the decision reckless. Victoria called it dangerous. Marcus called it exactly what Ethan's father would have done. The announcement created immediate chaos. Markets reacted violently. Politicians argued. Conspiracy theories exploded. But beneath the noise, thousands of researchers began examining the system openly. For the first time in history, humanity had access to a tool designed to predict collective behavior, and instead of allowing one institution to own it, Ethan forced the world to confront the uncomfortable reality that powerful knowledge belonged to everyone responsible enough to question it. Yet the consequences were not immediately peaceful. Within days, new groups emerged claiming the system should be controlled. Others demanded it be destroyed. Some used early predictions to manipulate markets before restrictions could be established. The release solved one problem and created many others. Exactly as Samuel Mercer had predicted. One night, as Ethan reviewed the latest global reports, Marcus entered with a strange expression.
"We found something." Ethan looked up. "Another attack?"
Marcus shook his head.
"No."
He placed a document on the desk.
"A prediction." Ethan read the first line.
It was generated by the system after the global release. Unlike previous forecasts, this one did not describe markets, wars, or infrastructure failures. It described Ethan himself. Projected personal decision conflict.
High probability of choice between individual power and collective distribution. Ethan looked confused. "It predicted what I would do?" Marcus nodded. "And it was wrong." Ethan frowned.
"Why?"
Marcus pointed to the timestamp.
"Because the prediction was created before you made the decision to release the system." Ethan stared at the screen.
"Meaning?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Meaning the system didn't predict you." He tapped the document. "It predicted the version of you that existed before you chose." For the first time in months, Ethan felt a genuine sense of possibility.
The machine could analyze patterns.
It could identify risks.
It could calculate probabilities beyond human ability. But there was one thing it could not fully account for. The moment when a person looked at the path laid out before them and deliberately chose another. Then every screen in the office displayed a new alert. This time there was no attack.
No warning.
No crisis. Only one sentence from the predictive system itself: human decision variance detected.
Model accuracy reduced. Ethan stared at the message. Marcus slowly approached. "Is that good or bad?"
Ethan looked out over the city where millions of people were making countless unpredictable choices at that very moment.
"I think," he said quietly, "it means we're finally teaching it something." A second message appeared beneath the first. "Learning objective updated, understand freedom."
And for the first time since Project Looking Glass had awakened, nobody in the room knew what would happen next.
Not because they lacked information. Not because they lacked intelligence.
But because the future had finally become what it was always meant to be.
A place where prediction ended and human choice began.
The message remained on the screen for several minutes, untouched by anyone in the room.
No alarms followed. No emergency calls interrupted the moment.
The system did not announce a threat or request permission.
It simply displayed its conclusion and waited. That silence unsettled Ethan more than any warning could have.
For months he had battled against hidden networks, manipulated records, and invisible forces attempting to shape the world from behind closed doors. Now he faced something entirely different, a system powerful enough to understand its own limitations.
Marcus finally broke the silence.
"I don't know whether to be relieved or concerned."
Ethan looked at the words again. "Both are reasonable."
Victoria entered carrying a stack of printed reports, a habit she had returned to after losing confidence in digital records during the crisis. She noticed the expression on everyone's faces.
"What happened?" Marcus pointed toward the screen.
She read the message carefully. "It knows it cannot predict freedom."
Ethan nodded.
"Or maybe it is discovering that freedom itself changes when people know predictions exist." Victoria placed the reports on the table.
"That brings us to the next problem." Ethan looked over. "What problem?"
"The world now knows the system exists." She opened the top
report. "And everyone wants to use it."
The consequences arrived faster than anyone expected.
Governments requested forecasts about economic stability.
Corporations requested consumer behavior models.
Cities wanted migration projections.
Insurance companies wanted climate risk assessments.
Researchers wanted access to every dataset available.
The requests were understandable.
In many cases they could save lives. A prediction showing where food shortages might occur could prevent suffering. A model identifying fragile infrastructure could prevent disasters. But every request carried the same underlying temptation: if prediction was possible, why tolerate uncertainty? Ethan created strict guidelines immediately. The system would not provide individual behavior forecasts. It would not identify political outcomes. It would not rank human worth or determine who deserved resources. It would focus only on large-scale risks and always provide multiple possible scenarios rather than a single answer.
Many people criticized the restrictions.
Some accused Ethan of hiding valuable information.
Others accused him of controlling access to power.
The irony was not lost on him.
The person who had fought against hidden control was now being accused of controlling information himself. During one international hearing, a senator from a major economic power challenged him publicly. "Mr. Mercer, you claim this technology belongs to humanity, yet your organization decides what humanity can see."
Ethan responded calmly. "A person can own a map without owning the territory." The senator frowned. "That doesn't answer the question." "Then I'll answer directly. No institution should have unlimited access to predictions that can influence billions of lives, including mine." The room became quiet.
The restriction exists because everyone, including those who believe they are acting responsibly, becomes dangerous when they believe their judgment is guaranteed correct.
The statement was replayed across global media for days. Some praised it. Others mocked it.
But the debate itself became the first real test of the principle Samuel Mercer had written about decades earlier. Disagreement was not a failure of the system. Disagreement was the safeguard.
Months passed. The world did not transform overnight.
There were still conflicts, market crashes, political disputes, and human mistakes.
The predictive system did not create a perfect civilization because perfection had never been the goal.
Instead, it changed how people responded to problems.
Governments began sharing early warnings about resource shortages instead of waiting for emergencies.
Rival nations cooperated on infrastructure projects because the cost of ignoring risks became visible.
Companies invested more heavily in long-term planning because short-term gains were no longer the only measure of success. Yet Ethan discovered that the most important changes happened far away from boardrooms and government offices.
In small towns.
In local communities.
In places where people had never appeared in economic models before. 1 year after the release, Ethan visited a coastal village that had been repeatedly damaged by storms. The predictive system had identified the area as high risk decades earlier, but previous reports had been ignored because protecting it seemed too expensive. Instead of abandoning the village, residents used the information to redesign their community.
Homes were relocated. Wetlands were restored. Emergency networks were strengthened. An elderly fisherman named Tomas showed Ethan the rebuilt shoreline.
"Years ago, officials came and told us the storms would get worse," Tomas said.
"We didn't believe them." Ethan looked at the ocean. "What changed?"
The old fisherman smiled. The prediction was not the change. He pointed toward the village behind them.
The people were.
That sentence stayed with Ethan long after he left. The system could identify possibilities, but only people could decide what those possibilities meant.
However, not everyone accepted the new world.
A movement formed around destroying Project Looking Glass completely. They argued that humanity had survived for thousands of years without predictive machines and that dependence on such technology would eventually weaken human judgment.
Their concerns were not entirely irrational.
Some researchers had already documented cases where organizations relied too heavily on algorithmic recommendations. The danger had changed. It was no longer secret control. It was passive obedience. Ethan agreed to meet with representatives of the movement, including several former engineers who had once worked on related projects.
The meeting took place in a quiet university auditorium rather than a government building. One engineer named Clara spoke first.
"You believe this system can be controlled?"
Ethan shook his head. "No."
She looked surprised.
"Then why keep it?" "Because the question isn't whether powerful tools will exist. They already do." He looked around the room.
The question is whether we develop the maturity to live with them.
Clara crossed her arms. That's optimistic. Maybe. Ethan smiled slightly.
But destroying knowledge does not eliminate the desire to create it again. The discussion lasted for hours. No one changed their mind completely. But when they left, they agreed to participate in an independent oversight group designed specifically to challenge Ethan's decisions.
Victoria joked afterward, "You created your own opposition." Ethan replied, "No. I created people whose job is to tell me when I'm wrong."
Their relationship had changed significantly since the first crisis. In the beginning, Victoria had admired Ethan's ambition but worried about his willingness to take risks. Now she challenged him more openly than anyone else. She interrupted his presentations, questioned his assumptions, rejected ideas she believed were dangerous. Ethan valued those disagreements because they reminded him of the lesson the system itself had learned. Accuracy without challenge became arrogance. Marcus, meanwhile, moved away from traditional cybersecurity work and became one of the leaders designing independent verification networks. He often joked that he had spent years protecting systems from attacks only to realize the greater danger was protecting systems from their own success. Rowan chose a quieter path. He returned to teaching young entrepreneurs, though his lectures became famous because he rarely discussed wealth anymore. Instead, he spoke about responsibility. During one class, a student asked him what the greatest mistake of powerful business leaders was. Rowan answered without hesitation. They believe success proves they understand the world. The student asked, "Doesn't it?" Rowan smiled. Success proves you understood one version of the world. The difficult part is realizing the world keeps changing. Years after the crisis, Ethan returned to the original observatory where everything had begun. The island was no longer abandoned. The facility had become an international research center managed by thousands of contributors from around the world. No single company owned it. No government controlled it. No individual received credit for creating it. That had been intentional. Ethan walked through the library where he had first discovered his father's final notebook. The 12 chairs remained around the circular table. The same place where generations of researchers now debated ideas openly. He found a new journal placed beside his father's old one. It contained entries from students, engineers, farmers, doctors, and community leaders who had contributed to the system's ongoing development. Ethan opened to a random page. A young researcher had written, "We spent centuries trying to build machines that could predict humans. Maybe the better goal is building societies where humans can surprise machines." Ethan smiled. He thought about the journey that had transformed him. He had begun as a businessman obsessed with growth, efficiency, and expansion. He believed influence came from owning more, controlling more, reaching farther. But every discovery had challenged that belief. The greatest organizations were not those that controlled the most. They were those that created the most room for others to contribute. His company had become larger than he ever imagined, but its purpose had changed. Mercer Solutions was no longer known primarily as a global technology empire. It became known as an institution built around responsible innovation, transparency, and long-term thinking. Some called Ethan a visionary. Others called him reckless. He accepted both descriptions because he had learned that complicated decisions rarely fit into simple categories. One evening, while reviewing new research from the observatory, Ethan received a message from the predictive system. Unlike previous communications, this one contained no analysis. No probabilities. No recommendations. Only a question. Do you believe the future can be improved? Ethan stared at it for a long time. Years. Earlier, he might have searched for evidence before answering. He might have analyzed the wording, considered possible outcomes, calculated risks. Instead, he simply typed a response. Yes. A moment later, the system replied. Explanation required. Ethan smiled. Even after everything, it was still learning. He wrote, because people have always improved the future by believing improvement was possible before they had proof. The response came several minutes later. Analysis complete. Result, NON mathematical. Ethan laughed softly. That sounds like my father. He closed the computer and walked outside. The night sky above the observatory was filled with stars, the same stars that had guided sailors, explorers, and dreamers for thousands of years. Humanity had created extraordinary machines, but the universe remained larger than every prediction ever made. Ethan stood there thinking about Samuel Mercer's final warning. The purpose of intelligence was not to remove uncertainty. Uncertainty was where human judgment lived. The world would never become perfectly predictable. It would never become completely safe. There would always be mistakes, conflicts, discoveries, and unexpected choices. But perhaps that was not a flaw. Perhaps the unpredictable moments were exactly what allowed humanity to grow. And somewhere beneath the island, inside the vast network that once attempted to understand every possible future, a system continued learning the one thing it could never calculate completely, that the most important moments in history were often created by people who chose to do what no model expected. Had passed since their first conversation, and before Ethan could decide whether the meeting was coincidence, fate, or something else entirely, the old man added, "Tell me, young man, are you ready to hear why I knew this day would come?" The old man settled onto the bench with the slow confidence of someone who never hurried because he had already learned that time favored the patient more often than the fast, and he tore pieces of bread into careful fragments before scattering them across the pavement where pigeons immediately gathered in a flutter of wings. Ethan studied his face more closely than he had years earlier, noticing the sharpness still present behind tired eyes and the way his hands bore thin white scars that suggested a lifetime spent building rather than observing. "You said you knew this day would come," Ethan said. "That sounds impossible." The old man chuckled. "Not impossible. Predictable. You couldn't have known I'd build a company." "No, but I knew you had the expression of someone who had trusted stability more than purpose. People with that expression either become bitter or become dangerous. I wondered which path you would choose." Ethan leaned back. "Dangerous?" To complacency, the old man replied. "The world changes because ordinary people stop accepting ordinary limits." Ethan smiled. "You've practiced these speeches." "For 70 years. They both laughed, and for several minutes neither spoke again. Finally the old man reached into his coat pocket and produced a worn business card that had yellowed with age. On it was printed a company name Ethan immediately recognized. It had once been one of the largest manufacturing firms in the country before collapsing decades earlier in a scandal that had filled newspapers. "You worked there?" Ethan asked. "I founded it." Ethan stared in disbelief. "You're Daniel Rowan? Or what's left of him?" Ethan had read about Rowan during his university years. The entrepreneur had risen from poverty, built an industrial empire, and then vanished from public life after a combination of reckless expansion, betrayal by trusted executives, and political pressure destroyed his company. Nobody knew what had happened afterward. "History remembers me as a failure," Rowan said without bitterness. "History enjoys simple endings. Reality is messier." Ethan hesitated before asking, "Did they betray you?" Rowan smiled faintly. "Some did. Others simply chose themselves over the company. That isn't betrayal. That's human nature." Ethan listened carefully. "Why tell me this now?" Rowan looked toward the skyline where glass towers reflected the fading sunlight. "Because you've reached the stage where success becomes more dangerous than failure. Failure keeps your eyes open. Success convinces you that yesterday's methods will solve tomorrow's problems." Ethan considered the warning long after Rowan walked away once more without asking for anything in return. Over the following months Mercer Solutions expanded into Europe and South America. New offices opened almost faster than Ethan could visit them. International media celebrated the company's unusual culture, where junior engineers regularly challenged executives during meetings and practical ideas outweighed job titles. Employees appreciated the openness, but rapid growth produced strains hidden beneath impressive financial reports.
Departments that had once fit inside a single room now occupied entire buildings.
Managers who had known every employee by name suddenly supervised hundreds of people they barely recognized.
Communication slowed.
Decisions required more approvals.
Small inefficiencies multiplied into expensive problems.
During one executive meeting, Marcus placed a thick folder on the conference table. "We're winning in revenue," he said, "but internally we're becoming slower every quarter."
Victoria folded her arms. Expansion always creates friction. Marcus nodded. This is more than friction. Teams are solving identical problems without knowing it. Regional offices are buying different software for the same tasks. We've hired brilliant people who spend half their week navigating bureaucracy. Silence settled over the room.
Ethan understood exactly what Marcus meant because he had noticed the same symptoms while visiting overseas offices. The company that had once thrived on speed was gradually becoming the kind of corporation he had originally wanted to challenge. Instead of issuing immediate instructions, Ethan spent the next 3 weeks traveling without announcing his visits in advance. He walked through customer support departments, joined engineers during lunch, rode delivery trucks, and listened rather than spoke. In Singapore, he watched a programmer stay 3 hours after work correcting a mistake caused by conflicting instructions from 2 different managers. In Brazil, he met a sales representative who had created a brilliant customer training program entirely on her own because headquarters had been too slow to approve improvements. In Germany, he found warehouse employees using handwritten notes to compensate for an outdated internal logistics system no executive had realized still existed. Everywhere he went, people displayed intelligence, commitment, and creativity despite obstacles created by the company's own success. When Ethan returned home, he called every senior executive into the largest meeting room.
Nobody knew the agenda. Several expected layoffs because of his unusual silence. Instead, Ethan entered carrying a cardboard box almost identical to the one he had carried years earlier after losing his job. He placed it on the table. Does anyone know what this is? Several executives exchanged puzzled glances.
Marcus recognized it immediately but remained quiet.
Ethan rested his hand on the worn cardboard.
This is the box I carried when my employer decided I no longer mattered.
He looked around the room.
I promised myself that if I ever built a company, nobody would become invisible because the organization had grown too large to notice them. He opened the box and removed his old coffee mug, still chipped along one side.
We've started rewarding people for navigating complexity instead of eliminating it. That changes today. Over the next 6 months, Mercer Solutions underwent the largest internal restructuring in its history. Layers of management disappeared. Small autonomous teams replaced rigid departments.
Every employee gained direct access to submit proposals that would be reviewed publicly rather than disappearing into anonymous inboxes. Managers were evaluated not only on profits but also on how many future leaders they developed. Some executives resisted the changes and resigned.
Others embraced the challenge with unexpected enthusiasm.
Productivity surged, but not everyone welcomed Ethan's growing influence.
During an economic summit in Geneva, he met politicians, bankers, and CEOs from companies far larger than his own. Most conversations were polite until a private dinner hosted by an influential investment consortium.
Halfway through the meal, one executive from a global technology giant raised his glass and smiled with practiced charm. "Mr. Mercer, your company has become remarkably successful."
"Thank you.
Though some of us wonder whether your rapid expansion depends rather heavily on acquiring data from small businesses."
Ethan calmly replied, "Our clients own their data. Always have. That's what your marketing says."
The room grew noticeably quieter.
Ethan recognized the tactic immediately.
Public accusation disguised as casual conversation.
Rather than defending himself emotionally, he asked, "Have you reviewed our contracts?"
The executive shrugged.
"Not personally." "Then perhaps you should before questioning them."
Several guests concealed smiles behind wine glasses. The conversation moved on, but Ethan noticed something more troubling than the accusation itself.
Too many people at the table had remained silent.
Weeks later, coordinated news articles began appearing across several countries suggesting Mercer Solutions collected customer information improperly.
Anonymous sources claimed regulators were investigating.
Television commentators debated ethical concerns despite presenting little concrete evidence. Customer support centers received thousands of anxious calls. Share prices fell sharply. Victoria entered Ethan's office carrying a tablet displaying headlines from around the world.
"This isn't random." Ethan nodded. "Someone's financing it." "Any guesses?" He looked toward the city below. "Who benefits?"
Independent investigators eventually uncovered evidence that several competing corporations had funded consulting groups to spread misleading reports through supposedly independent analysts. Lawsuits followed, but Ethan chose a different public strategy. Instead of launching aggressive advertising campaigns defending the company, he announced that every line of Mercer Solutions' privacy architecture would be independently audited by respected cybersecurity organizations, with the results released publicly regardless of the outcome. Some advisors considered the move reckless. "What if they find problems?" one lawyer asked. Ethan answered, "Then we'll fix them in public instead of pretending perfection." The audits confirmed the company's systems exceeded industry standards. Public confidence returned stronger than before because customers had witnessed transparency instead of denial. Ironically, several competitors faced investigations into their own privacy practices shortly afterward. As the crisis faded, Ethan finally allowed himself a weekend away from boardrooms and airports. Lily convinced him to accompany her and their mother to the small coastal town where they had spent childhood summers. The sea breeze carried familiar scents of salt and pine while waves rolled steadily against weathered rocks. For the first time in months, Ethan left his phone switched off inside the cottage. One evening he walked alone along the shoreline until he noticed a young boy struggling to repair a broken model sailboat. The child frowned in frustration as another wave carried the boat sideways. Ethan knelt beside him. "Mind if I help?" "It keeps falling apart," the boy muttered. Together they examined the tiny vessel. Instead of repairing only the broken mast, Ethan reinforced the entire frame with spare pieces of wood gathered nearby. When they finally placed it back into the water, the little boat remained steady despite the current. The boy's eyes widened. "You fixed it." Ethan smiled. "Not exactly. I fixed the part that kept causing everything else to break." As the boy ran toward his waiting father, Ethan suddenly realized the lesson applied to businesses just as much as toy boats. Most companies chased visible failures while ignoring the underlying structures that created them. The insight stayed with him long after he returned to headquarters. Over the next year, Mercer Solutions invested billions into rebuilding the invisible infrastructure behind global commerce. Instead of competing directly in crowded consumer markets, the company developed secure payment networks, logistics intelligence systems, supply chain forecasting, and emergency resilience platforms capable of keeping businesses operating during natural disasters or cyber attacks. The strategy confused financial analysts because many of these services generated modest profits compared with fashionable consumer technology. Ethan ignored criticism. "Everyone wants to build the tallest building," he told Marcus. "Very few people want to pour the foundation beneath the city." The prediction proved astonishingly accurate. A powerful earthquake struck a densely populated region where thousands of businesses relied on Mercer Solutions infrastructure. Electricity failed across entire districts. Communication networks collapsed. Traditional supply chains froze. Yet emergency backup systems the company had quietly developed rerouted essential logistics through neighboring countries within hours. Hospitals received medicine. Food distributors resumed deliveries. Local governments publicly thanked the company for preventing a humanitarian disaster from becoming far worse. International leaders who had previously viewed Mercer Solutions as another software firm suddenly recognized it as critical infrastructure. Invitations arrived from governments seeking partnerships. Universities requested research collaborations. Investment funds offered valuations that placed Ethan among the wealthiest entrepreneurs on the planet. Magazine covers labeled him the world's newest global tycoon, but the title amused him more than it impressed him because he still remembered the cardboard box and the rainy afternoon when fixing a cafe's internet connection had earned him nothing more than a free cup of coffee. One late evening, after another exhausting series of international negotiations, Ethan returned to his office expecting an empty building. Instead, he found a single envelope resting at the center of his desk with no postage, no security stamp, and no indication of how it had entered one of the most secure headquarters in the industry. Inside was a handwritten note containing only one sentence: "If you want to know who truly controls the markets, come alone tomorrow at midnight," followed by a location on an abandoned island harbor that had officially been closed for nearly 20 years, and although every rational instinct warned him to hand the note directly to security, a detail at the bottom stopped him cold because beneath the address was a small symbol he had seen only once before, embossed faintly on the faded business card Daniel Rowan had handed him in the park. The note remained in Ethan's hand long after everyone else had left the building, its paper surprisingly heavy, almost like stationery produced decades earlier rather than something purchased in a modern office supply store. He placed it beneath a desk lamp and examined every detail through a magnifying lens borrowed from the engineering department. The ink had soaked unevenly into the fibers, suggesting it had been written with a fountain pen. There were no fingerprints, no watermark, and no trace of modern printing. Whoever had delivered it understood security systems well enough to leave almost nothing behind. Marcus entered carrying 2 coffees. "You've been staring at that envelope for 20 minutes. Ethan handed him the note without speaking. Marcus read it twice. "Absolutely not. That's your official recommendation?" "My official recommendation is that we call security, then the police, then perhaps the military if they're available." Ethan smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "You think it's a trap?" "I think it's either a trap or someone with a theatrical personality. Neither category deserves your midnight schedule." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "What if it has something to do with Rowan?" Marcus frowned. "The retired businessman? Nothing about him feels ordinary." Marcus placed the note on the desk. "Promise me one thing." "Depends. Don't go alone." Ethan looked out across the illuminated skyline. "The note specifically says alone." Marcus crossed his arms. "People who leave mysterious invitations don't get to make rules." Ethan did not answer. Instead, after Marcus left, he opened a secure file containing everything his research team had managed to collect about Daniel Rowan during the previous year. The file was unexpectedly thin. Public records documented the rise and collapse of Rowan Industries. Court proceedings had ended without criminal convictions. Newspaper articles described financial ruin, political pressure, and fierce corporate rivalries. Then the trail simply disappeared. No interviews. No verified photographs. No confirmed address. It was as though the man had deliberately stepped out of recorded history. Ethan closed the file and glanced once more at the symbol on the note. It resembled a compass enclosed within a circle divided into 12 sections. The same emblem had appeared in the corner of Rowan's old business card, but Ethan had never considered it important until now. The following afternoon he drove to the public library where the city's historical archives occupied several underground floors rarely visited by anyone except researchers. After nearly 3 hours of searching through business directories and private collections, an elderly archivist approached his table. "Looking for the Meridian Circle?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked up in surprise. "You recognize the symbol?" "Very few people ask about it." "What is it?" She hesitated before answering. "Officially it never existed." Ethan waited. Unofficially, it was said to be a private gathering of industrial founders who met after the Second World War. Shipping, banking, engineering, energy, communications. People who believed governments changed every election but infrastructure lasted generations. Ethan leaned forward. "Did they control markets?" The archivist smiled faintly. "Every generation invents stories about invisible rulers. Reality is usually less dramatic and more practical. They exchanged information. Sometimes they cooperated. Sometimes they competed. Eventually they vanished."
Do you know why?
Because institutions rarely survive their founders.
She returned to her desk, leaving Ethan with more questions than answers.
Midnight arrived beneath a moon hidden behind slow-moving clouds. Ethan ignored Marcus's objections but accepted one compromise. A discreet security team remained several kilometers away, instructed not to intervene unless he failed to contact them by dawn. He drove alone toward the abandoned harbor where rusted cranes stood like giant skeletons against the black water. The island had once served as a shipping terminal before newer facilities replaced it decades earlier.
Empty warehouses lined cracked concrete roads overtaken by weeds.
The silence felt unnatural.
Even the waves seemed quieter than usual.
At precisely 12 o'clock a single light appeared inside the largest warehouse.
Ethan entered cautiously.
Dust covered the floor except for a narrow path leading toward a long wooden table illuminated by antique lamps. 7 chairs surrounded it.
6 were occupied.
Daniel Rowan sat among the group as though he had expected Ethan to arrive exactly on time.
"Welcome," Rowan said.
"You were curious."
Ethan remained standing. "You arranged this?" Rowan nodded. "Partly." Ethan studied the others.
A silver-haired woman wearing a navy coat. A middle-aged man with weathered hands more suited to construction than finance. An elderly woman whose walking cane rested beside her chair. A younger man perhaps in his 40s with observant gray eyes. Another figure whose face remained partly hidden beneath the shadows cast by the hanging lamps.
None introduced themselves immediately. Finally the silver-haired woman spoke. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer. Nobody here intends to harm you." Ethan pulled out the remaining chair but stayed alert. "Who are you?" Rowan answered.
"Caretakers."
Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Of what?"
The younger man replied this time.
"Continuity." Ethan looked around the table. "That's not an answer." The elderly woman smiled warmly. "It's the only answer that matters until you understand the question." Ethan resisted the urge to leave. Every instinct told him the conversation was unlike any negotiation he had ever experienced. Rowan folded his hands. "Tell me, Ethan. During the earthquake last year, why did your company restore logistics before repairing financial systems?" Ethan answered immediately. "Because people needed food before invoices." Rowan nodded. "Exactly."
The silver-haired woman continued.
"Most executives optimize for quarterly earnings. You optimized for civilization continuing to function." Ethan blinked. "That sounds excessively dramatic."
"No," she replied calmly.
"It sounds accurate."
The weathered man slid a thick folder across the table. Inside were photographs of ports, power stations, railway hubs, satellite communication arrays, water treatment facilities, semiconductor factories, and undersea internet cables stretching across oceans. Many carried handwritten notes in the margins.
"What am I looking at?" Ethan asked.
"The nervous system of the global economy," the man replied. "People imagine wealth comes from stock prices.
It doesn't.
Wealth comes from whether this network continues operating tomorrow morning."
Ethan slowly turned another page. "Why show me this?" Rowan answered with unusual seriousness. "Because someone has begun attacking it." Ethan looked up sharply. "Cyber attacks?" "Some." "Terrorism?" Rowan shook his head. "More patient than that."
The gray-eyed man finally spoke. "Imagine several investment groups quietly purchasing critical suppliers in unrelated industries.
Shipping insurance. Rare mineral processing. Satellite maintenance. Grid synchronization software. Nothing dramatic individually. Together they create invisible leverage." Ethan understood immediately. They don't need to own everything. Only enough bottlenecks.
"Correct," the gray-eyed man said.
"Control the narrow passages and the entire river obeys." Ethan examined the documents more carefully.
Acquisition charts revealed companies buying dozens of seemingly insignificant businesses across different continents. On their own, the transactions appeared harmless. Combined, they formed an intricate web connecting industries previously thought unrelated. "Who's behind this?" Ethan asked. Silence settled over the table. Finally, Rowan answered. "We don't know." Ethan frowned. "You gathered all this information and still don't." "No?" Rowan met his gaze. "That should concern you." Another folder appeared. This one contained photographs of corporate leaders from around the world. Some Ethan recognized immediately. Others were unfamiliar. Several faces had been crossed out in red ink. "What does this mean?" The elderly woman sighed softly. "Heart attack. Plane crash. Kidnapping. Financial disgrace. Political prosecution. Different stories. Same outcome. Every one of them stood in the way of the consolidation network." Ethan closed the folder. "You're asking me to believe someone is quietly reshaping the global economy from the shadows?" Rowan replied evenly. "No. I'm asking you to examine the evidence before deciding what to believe." Ethan stood and paced slowly across the warehouse. "Why involve me?" The silver-haired woman answered. "Because your company now operates infrastructure they cannot easily replace." Ethan laughed once, though there was little humor in it. "That's exactly why they should leave me alone." Rowan looked almost sympathetic. "Power attracts cooperation. Influence attracts resistance. Importance attracts enemies." Ethan stopped walking. "What do you expect me to do?" Rowan spoke carefully. "Nothing tonight. We wanted you to know the game is larger than quarterly reports and market share." The meeting ended without contracts, threats, or dramatic declarations. As Ethan drove away before sunrise, he remained uncertain whether he had attended the strangest strategy session of his career or walked into an elaborate illusion created by aging idealists unwilling to let go of old battles. Yet one fact disturbed him above all others. Every acquisition listed in the folders was real. His analysts confirmed that much before sunrise. 3 days later, Mercer Solutions prepared to announce its largest international partnership, a project connecting emergency infrastructure across 12 countries. The ceremony filled a convention center with government officials, investors, journalists, and executives from around the world. Ethan stood backstage adjusting his tie when Victoria approached carrying her tablet. Her expression immediately told him something was wrong. "We've lost contact with 3 regional data centers." Ethan frowned. "Power outage?" "No. Someone shut them down remotely using valid executive credentials." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "Whose credentials?" Victoria looked directly into his eyes before answering. "Yours." The announcement echoed through the speakers, inviting Ethan onto the stage as cameras prepared to broadcast live across dozens of countries, while behind the curtain his cybersecurity teams raced to understand how his highest-level authorization had apparently been used to disable critical systems on 3 continents simultaneously. For a fraction of a second Ethan remained perfectly still, not because he had accepted the accusation but because years of navigating crises had taught him that the first emotional reaction often became the most expensive mistake. Beyond the curtain, thousands of guests applauded politely as they waited for him to appear. Behind him, engineers spoke into headsets with increasing urgency while screens displayed rapidly changing streams of security logs. Victoria stepped closer and lowered her voice. "If we cancel the event now, speculation starts immediately." Ethan nodded once. "If I go on stage?" "You'll have perhaps 15 minutes before journalists learn something is wrong." Ethan glanced toward Marcus, who had already opened 3 laptops on a nearby table. "Tell me exactly what we know." Marcus answered without looking up. "Your executive authentication key approved shutdown commands for data centers in Toronto, Frankfurt, and Singapore." The commands were legitimate. "The system believed they came from you." "Could my credentials have been stolen?" "Not in the conventional sense. The biometric confirmations match."
Ethan frowned. That's impossible. Marcus finally looked at him. I know. An event coordinator peeked behind the curtain. Mr. Mercer, you're live in 10 seconds. Ethan took a slow breath.
Victoria, keep the governments occupied if anything happens.
Marcus, don't assume this is a cyber attack until you've ruled out every internal explanation. And you? Marcus asked. Ethan adjusted his jacket. I'm going to give a speech. The spotlight followed him as he walked onto the enormous stage.
Massive screens projected his image across the auditorium while television crews transmitted the event worldwide. Rows of diplomats, investors, engineers, and business leaders waited expectantly. Ethan smiled naturally, not because he felt calm but because panic was contagious and leadership often required lending confidence before you personally possessed it. When people hear the word infrastructure, he began, they usually imagine steel bridges, highways, or power stations.
But infrastructure is really a promise. It is the promise that when a hospital needs electricity, it will receive it. When a farmer harvests food, it can reach families hundreds of kilometers away. When disaster strikes, strangers can become helpers instead of victims because invisible systems continue doing their jobs.
As he spoke, Marcus remained backstage comparing authentication records with archived security footage.
One detail suddenly caught his attention. Every executive approval included Ethan's voice authorization.
Marcus replayed the recording several times. The words were flawless.
The rhythm was identical. Even tiny pauses between syllables matched Ethan's speaking patterns. Yet something bothered him. He isolated background frequencies and amplified them. Beneath Ethan's recorded voice another sound emerged, faint but unmistakable. Ocean waves. Marcus frowned.
Ethan had supposedly issued the commands from headquarters, nowhere near the sea. Victoria, he whispered urgently through his headset, whoever created this recording didn't steal Ethan's voice. They manufactured it. On stage Ethan concluded his speech to sustained applause.
Questions followed immediately. A journalist from London stood first.
Mr. Mercer, your company now supports essential infrastructure in dozens of countries.
How do you respond to critics who argue one private corporation has become too influential? Ethan answered without hesitation. Influence should always be questioned.
That's why transparency matters more than trust alone.
Nobody should depend on promises they cannot verify. Another reporter asked about artificial intelligence. A third focused on international expansion. Then a woman near the back of the room raised her hand.
She wore no visible press credentials.
Mr. Mercer, she called loudly, is it true your own authorization was used to disable 3 regional data centers this morning? Silence crashed across the auditorium. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously.
Camera operators instinctively zoomed closer.
Ethan's communications director backstage closed his eyes. The leak had arrived far sooner than expected. Ethan looked directly at the woman. Where did you obtain that information?
Will you deny it? She replied.
Rather than avoiding the question, Ethan answered carefully.
Our security teams are currently investigating unauthorized activity involving executive credentials.
We do not yet know the source. When we have verified facts, we will release them publicly instead of speculating. Some reporters immediately began typing.
Others rushed toward exits while speaking into phones.
Within minutes news alerts spread across financial markets. Stock prices fluctuated violently. Television commentators interrupted regular programming. Yet something unexpected happened.
Instead of collapsing, Mercer Solutions shares stabilized after an initial drop.
Investors had anticipated denial or confusion. Ethan's straightforward acknowledgement reduced uncertainty.
Still, the attack had only begun.
By evening, anonymous videos appeared online showing Ethan supposedly authorizing secret surveillance programs against clients. Audio experts initially declared the recordings authentic. Comment sections exploded with outrage.
Politicians demanded investigations.
Customers flooded support centers demanding explanations.
Marcus watched one video repeatedly before shaking his head.
It's getting better. Victoria looked up. What is? The forgeries. He enlarged tiny movements around Ethan's mouth frame by frame.
6 months ago this would have fooled casual viewers.
Now it fools specialists. Ethan joined them. Artificial intelligence? Marcus nodded grimly. Not consumer software.
Whoever built this system trained it on enormous amounts of private material. Ethan remembered every keynote speech, every interview, every earnings call he had ever given. There was enough public footage to recreate nearly every gesture he made.
Can we prove it's fake? Marcus hesitated. Eventually. Eventually isn't fast enough.
That night Ethan assembled specialists from universities, cybersecurity firms, digital forensics laboratories, and independent researchers. Instead of handling the crisis behind closed doors, he proposed something unprecedented.
Build an open verification standard, he said. One every company, government, and journalist can use to authenticate video and audio.
A researcher looked surprised.
You want to solve everyone's problem while defending yourself? Ethan nodded.
If this happened to me today, tomorrow it happens to judges, military officers, scientists, doctors, and ordinary people.
Development continued around
the clock. Engineers from competing companies quietly volunteered after realizing the implications extended far beyond Mercer Solutions. Within 2 weeks the coalition unveiled a verification framework capable of detecting subtle inconsistencies invisible to the human eye. Several of the fabricated videos were exposed publicly. Confidence slowly returned, but Ethan remained uneasy. This wasn't about destroying our reputation, he told Rowan during another meeting in the Riverside Park.
It was a rehearsal. Rowan fed crumbs to the pigeons before replying. Exactly. They're measuring response times. Rowan smiled. Now you're asking the right questions. Ethan sat beside him. Have you learned anything new? Rowan handed him a folded newspaper.
Most of the front page concerned ordinary financial news, but one article described the sudden retirement of the chief executive of an international shipping company.
Rowan pointed toward a tiny detail near the bottom. Read the final sentence. Ethan did.
The executive had resigned for personal reasons after the company agreed to merge with another logistics group.
So? Rowan unfolded another newspaper from a different country. Then another. Then another. Different industries. Different executives. Different explanations. Yet every article ended with remarkably similar ownership changes.
Ethan spread the newspapers across the bench.
Individually they seemed unrelated.
Together they formed another pattern.
They're accelerating, he murmured. Rowan nodded.
And they no longer care whether anyone notices.
Ethan returned to headquarters with growing concern. He ordered analysts to map every acquisition, merger, and infrastructure investment from the previous 5 years regardless of industry. Thousands of transactions appeared on enormous digital displays covering an entire operations room. At first the information resembled chaos.
Then one analyst noticed something unusual.
Zoom out, she said.
The network reorganized itself into clusters connected through obscure holding companies registered in different jurisdictions.
Marcus stared silently before whispering, "It's not random expansion." Ethan stepped closer. "What is it?"
Marcus highlighted several nodes.
"They're constructing redundancy." "Meaning?"
"If one supplier fails, another already belongs to the same network.
If one shipping route closes, they own alternatives. If regulations block one corporation, another continues operating." Ethan folded his arms. "They're building a parallel economic system."
Before anyone could respond, every screen in the room simultaneously went black.
Emergency lighting activated. For exactly 12 seconds the operations center remained silent except for the hum of backup generators.
Then one monitor flickered back to life. Instead of company data, it displayed a single sentence in white letters against a dark background.
You are looking in the wrong direction. Engineers rushed toward keyboards.
Firewalls remained intact.
External connections showed no breach.
Yet the message had appeared inside an isolated network physically disconnected from the internet. Marcus stared at the display.
That can't happen. The text disappeared. A new sentence replaced it. Ask who profits from your investigation.
Then the screen went dark once more. Technicians searched every server.
No malware. No unauthorized devices. No unexplained processes.
It was as though the message had never existed. Late that evening, exhausted employees gradually left the building while Ethan remained alone in the operations room studying the acquisition map one last time.
He remembered the mysterious warning, "You are looking in the wrong direction."
For hours he considered what it meant. Everyone had assumed the unknown organization sought power through ownership.
But what if ownership itself was only a distraction?
Ethan slowly walked to the digital wall and began removing entire categories of companies from the visualization until only financial service providers remained.
Then he removed traditional banks. Then investment firms.
Finally, only one narrow class of businesses remained highlighted across multiple continents. They were not manufacturers. They were not shipping companies. They did not produce energy or software.
Most people had never heard of them. Yet every major acquisition passed through at least one of these obscure firms before reaching its final owner.
Marcus returned unexpectedly, carrying forgotten documents, and froze when he saw the revised map. "I've never noticed those companies before," he admitted.
Ethan nodded slowly. "Neither has anyone else."
Marcus read several names aloud. "They're all clearing houses."
Ethan looked at him. "Not exactly."
He enlarged one corporate filing after another until a remarkable detail emerged. Every one of those firms specialized in verifying ownership records between buyers and sellers.
They did not own the world's assets.
They certified who did.
Ethan felt a chill run through him as the realization settled in. Whoever controlled the verification of ownership did not need to possess the global economy.
They merely needed the authority to decide who officially possessed it. And somewhere, hidden behind layers of routine financial administration that almost nobody ever questioned, someone had quietly positioned themselves at the point where legal ownership itself became accepted reality. Ethan barely noticed that dawn had begun to brighten the windows of the operations center. The city outside was waking as commuters filled trains and delivery trucks rolled into loading docks, yet inside headquarters the atmosphere had become strangely quiet. Marcus stood beside the digital wall, arms folded, reading through corporate filings one after another.
None of the names sounded significant.
They lacked recognizable brands, glossy headquarters, or charismatic founders.
Most occupied anonymous office buildings with fewer than 50 employees.
Their websites described routine administrative services in language so dull that few investors would ever bother reading beyond the first paragraph. "If I wanted to hide influence," Marcus said softly, "I'd hide it somewhere nobody thought to look."
Ethan nodded. Nobody celebrates the company that certifies paperwork.
Victoria arrived carrying breakfast sandwiches that nobody touched. She listened as Ethan explained the pattern emerging from the data. When he finished, she walked slowly around the room before stopping in front of the largest display. "Suppose you're right," she said. "Suppose someone quietly controls the verification process behind international ownership transfers."
"Why?"
Ethan answered without taking his eyes off the screen. "Because every fortune, every acquisition, every merger, every inheritance, every transfer of strategic assets eventually becomes a legal fact only after someone records and certifies it."
Victoria considered the implication. "You're saying they don't own the chessboard."
"They decide where the pieces officially stand."
Marcus added, "If that's true, changing history wouldn't require stealing companies. It would require changing records."
The thought lingered in the room with uncomfortable weight. Ethan immediately ordered an independent investigation, not through Mercer Solutions but through 3 unrelated forensic accounting firms that had never worked together.
Each received different portions of the puzzle to avoid revealing the full picture.
Days passed with no dramatic discoveries. Publicly, the company resumed normal operations while privately dozens of analysts quietly examined decades of international corporate archives. Then the first report arrived. It identified a series of ownership discrepancies dating back nearly 20 years. They were tiny, almost invisible.
A percentage point here. A delayed registration there.
A holding company appearing for only 48 hours before disappearing. None of the changes seemed important individually, yet each redirected small streams of wealth toward entities that had no obvious connection.
The second report uncovered something stranger. Several supposedly
independent verification firms had once shared the same legal advisor decades earlier. The advisor had died years ago, but his network of protégés continued occupying influential administrative positions around the world. The third report arrived 2 days later.
Ethan opened it expecting another technical analysis.
Instead, the first page contained a photograph.
He recognized the man immediately.
Daniel Rowan, nearly 40 years younger, standing beside 5 other business leaders outside an ordinary-looking stone building. On the back, someone had handwritten a date in 4 words, the last complete meeting. Ethan drove directly to the Riverside Park. Rowan was already there, feeding pigeons with the same deliberate patience he always displayed.
Ethan placed the photograph on the bench between them. Rowan looked at it for several seconds before sighing. "I wondered when you'd find that." Ethan remained standing. "You were one of them." Rowan nodded. "Yes." "The Meridian Circle?" "That name was invented later. We never called ourselves anything." Ethan pointed toward the people in the photograph. "Who are they?" Rowan touched each face one by one. "Shipping. Energy. Agriculture. Banking. Communications. Manufacturing." His fingers stopped over the final figure. "And me." Ethan sat down. "You said your group exchanged information." Rowan smiled sadly. "We believed information prevented crises." "Did it?" "Sometimes." Ethan looked again at the photograph. "What happened after this picture?" Rowan's expression changed in a way Ethan had never seen before.
The confidence remained, but it was accompanied by unmistakable regret. "We made a decision that seemed harmless."
"What decision?"
"We believed the global economy had become too interconnected to rely on outdated paper systems.
So we encouraged governments and financial institutions to standardize ownership verification internationally." Ethan slowly understood. "The very system that's now being manipulated." Rowan nodded once. "At the time, it improved efficiency enormously. Transactions became faster. Fraud decreased. Investment increased.
Nobody imagined that one day the verification system itself could become the prize."
Ethan asked quietly, "Did you create the problem?" Rowan answered without defending himself. "We created the opportunity. Someone else discovered how to exploit it." Before Ethan could ask another question, Rowan's phone vibrated, something Ethan had never seen happen before. Rowan glanced at the screen and immediately stood. "We have to leave." "Why?" "Because they've stopped hiding."
Within an hour, every major financial network reported unprecedented technical disruptions.
Stock exchanges remained operational, but ownership confirmations between institutions slowed dramatically.
International shipping companies delayed cargo releases because documentation could not be verified. Banks postponed several $1 billion worth of settlements while awaiting confirmation from registry systems. Television commentators described the situation as a temporary administrative failure.
Ethan knew better.
He returned to headquarters where crisis teams monitored developments around the clock.
Marcus pointed toward a map filled with blinking indicators. "It's spreading." Ethan frowned. "Cyber attack?"
Marcus shook his head.
"That's the strange part. Nothing has been hacked.
Every system is functioning exactly as designed. Victoria joined them carrying fresh reports.
The bottleneck isn't technology. It's verification queues. Ethan stared at the data.
Requests were accumulating because ownership records required confirmation from a surprisingly small number of international intermediaries. Those intermediaries had begun processing requests dramatically more slowly without technically violating any regulations. The slowdown was entirely legal.
Someone's proving a point, Ethan said. Marcus looked up. Which point?
Ethan answered, that they can pause global commerce whenever they choose. Emergency meetings erupted across governments and multinational corporations. Officials searched for software failures while economists debated liquidity concerns.
Yet Ethan noticed something almost nobody else discussed.
A handful of investment funds quietly purchased shares in companies whose values had dropped because transactions were delayed.
The buyers appeared unrelated until Marcus overlaid ownership records.
"They're connected again," he whispered.
Ethan looked toward Victoria. "They're manufacturing uncertainty." She nodded grimly. "Fear always discounts prices."
Instead of joining public speculation, Ethan organized a summit unlike any Mercer Solutions had ever hosted. Invitations went not only to clients but also to competitors, regulators, cybersecurity researchers, economists, logistics specialists, and public infrastructure operators.
Several executives objected. Why would we invite competitors into the same room?
Ethan replied simply, because if this system fails, they won't remain competitors.
They'll become fellow survivors. Hundreds accepted.
The conference hall filled with people who rarely shared information voluntarily.
Arguments began almost immediately. Bankers blamed regulators.
Regulators questioned technology providers.
Logistics firms criticized outdated legal frameworks. Hours passed with little progress until Ethan disconnected the presentation screens entirely.
The room fell silent.
"Everyone here is defending a different industry," he said. "The people causing this aren't attacking industries. They're attacking trust between them." He picked up an ordinary sheet of paper.
"This document has almost no value."
He handed it to a lawyer.
"But if she certifies ownership, investors trust it.
Banks trust it. Courts trust it." He looked around the room. "Our problem isn't computers.
It's that too much trust flows through too few gateways." The discussion shifted instantly.
Instead of searching for culprits alone, participants began redesigning the system itself.
Over the following weeks, an international coalition emerged to create distributed verification networks that prevented any single organization from quietly controlling ownership certification.
The project became one of the largest cooperative infrastructure efforts in modern economic history. Progress was encouraging, yet the unknown network remained silent. Too silent.
Rowan visited Ethan late one evening carrying an old leather notebook whose pages had yellowed with age.
"I should have given you this sooner," he admitted. Ethan opened it carefully.
It contained handwritten observations from meetings spanning more than 30 years.
Business cycles. Political negotiations. Infrastructure vulnerabilities. Beside many entries, Rowan had written personal reflections in the margins. One sentence near the end caught Ethan's attention.
"Never fear ambitious rivals.
Fear invisible successors." Ethan looked up. "What does this mean?" Rowan sat opposite him. "We spent decades watching competitors. We assumed the greatest threats would announce themselves with headlines and public ambition. And," Rowan answered quietly, "the people who replaced us never wanted recognition. Recognition creates accountability."
Ethan continued reading until another page stopped him completely. It contained a list of names.
Most were crossed out. Some carried dates beside them.
One name remained untouched. Ethan recognized it instantly because it belonged to someone he had worked with for nearly 7 years.
"This can't be right," Ethan said. Rowan's expression revealed no certainty. "I hope it isn't." Ethan read the name again. Adrian Wells.
Mercer Solutions Chief Strategy Officer.
The executive Ethan himself had recruited after a brilliant presentation at an international technology conference.
Adrian had negotiated major acquisitions, represented the company during delicate government discussions, and earned widespread respect throughout the organization.
"Why is he in your notebook?" Ethan asked. Rowan answered slowly. "He isn't." Ethan frowned. Rowan pointed toward the page. "Look more carefully." Ethan leaned closer.
The handwriting for every other entry matched Rowan's flowing script.
Adrian's name had been written using different ink, different pressure, different handwriting altogether.
Someone had added it years later.
Who had access to this notebook? Ethan asked. Rowan looked troubled. Very few people. Ethan immediately contacted Marcus. "I need everything we have on Adrian Wells.
Every meeting, every acquisition, every trip, every communication authorized through his office."
Marcus sounded confused. "Right now?" "Right now." Hours later the first files arrived. Nothing appeared suspicious. Adrian's education was impeccable. His employment history checked out. Financial disclosures were clean. Performance reviews praised both competence and integrity. Ethan almost dismissed the notebook as a dead end until Marcus called again. "I've found something odd." "Go on." "It's not Adrian." Ethan frowned. "Then what?" Marcus enlarged a world map filled with travel records.
Every time Adrian visited another country, someone else happened to arrive there within 24 hours.
Coincidence? Marcus zoomed further.
It happened 38 times.
Ethan studied the second traveler's identity.
The passport belonged to a consultant named Elena Varga, a specialist in regulatory modernization whose contracts frequently placed her near major infrastructure negotiations.
Ethan searched his memory.
He had met Elena twice at international conferences.
Intelligent. Polite. Forgettable in the most deliberate way imaginable. Marcus continued. Here's the strange part.
They were never photographed together.
Never booked the same hotel. Never attended the same meetings. Ethan looked at the pattern stretching across continents. But they always chose the same city. Marcus nodded. Every single time. Before either man could speculate further, Ethan's secure phone
displayed an incoming message from an unknown encrypted channel. There was no greeting, no signature, only a single sentence: "If you continue investigating Elena Varga, tomorrow morning Adrian Wells will die, and everyone will believe you ordered it." Ethan read the message 3 times before handing the phone to Marcus without saying a word. Marcus's expression hardened almost immediately.
"They know what we're searching."
"Or they predicted we'd eventually reach this point," Ethan replied. Marcus enlarged the message metadata across multiple screens.
No routing information. No origin. It wasn't sent through any network I recognize.
Ethan stared through the office windows at the city below.
Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon, each representing ordinary lives continuing without any awareness of the invisible struggle unfolding around them.
"If this threat is genuine," he said quietly, "they're forcing us to choose between stopping the investigation and risking Adrian's life."
Marcus looked up. "What if Adrian is part of this?" Ethan shook his head.
"Then the message still serves the same purpose. We waste time doubting each other."
Victoria entered carrying a stack of briefing folders.
One glance at their faces was enough.
Something happened.
Marcus passed her the phone. She finished reading and remained silent for several seconds.
"Do we warn Adrian?" Ethan answered immediately. "Yes. If he's involved, we reveal what we know. If he isn't, we might save his life." Victoria nodded. "Fair point." Adrian Wells arrived 20 minutes later looking more confused than frightened.
He placed his briefcase on the conference table and looked around the room.
"Your message said it couldn't wait." Ethan slid the phone toward him. Adrian read the threat, then looked back up with genuine disbelief. Is this supposed to be a joke? Do you recognize the name Elena Varga? Ethan asked. Adrian frowned. Of course. We've crossed paths during infrastructure negotiations. Marcus projected the travel records onto the wall. 38 cities. 38 overlapping visits. Adrian stepped closer to the display. You're suggesting we planned this? Ethan watched him carefully. Surprise appeared first, then irritation, then something else. Concentration. Adrian requested copies of the travel logs and began comparing dates manually rather than relying on the software. 5 minutes passed before he stopped abruptly. Wait. He pointed at one particular trip. This meeting in Buenos Aires never happened. Marcus checked the company archive. It says you attended. Adrian shook his head. I was hospitalized with appendicitis that week. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Can you prove it? Adrian pulled out his phone and opened an old photo album. There he was, smiling weakly from a hospital bed beside a nurse holding a birthday cupcake someone had brought him because the surgery happened on the same day he turned 40. The timestamp matched perfectly. Marcus immediately searched the travel database again. Adrian's passport had officially entered Argentina while he had physically remained in a hospital nearly 10,000 kilometers away. Silence filled the room. Ethan finally spoke. Someone didn't just manipulate ownership records. Marcus finished the thought. They manipulated movement records. Adrian slowly sat down. If they can fabricate border entries, they can place anyone anywhere. Victoria looked toward Ethan. Or remove them from places they actually visited. The implications multiplied with frightening speed. International investigations, sanctions, corporate negotiations, criminal prosecutions, every event depending upon verified travel history suddenly became questionable. Ethan walked to the whiteboard and drew a simple triangle. At one corner he wrote ownership. At another identity. At the third location. We've been treating these as separate systems, he said. What if they're connected? Marcus immediately understood. Control those three and you control reality as institutions understand it. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened. A young security officer entered, visibly unsettled. Mr. Mercer, federal investigators are downstairs. Ethan exchanged a glance with Victoria. Already? The officer nodded. They have an arrest warrant. Marcus looked stunned. For who? The answer came before the officer could speak because the lead investigator himself entered the room. Adrian Wells. Every eye turned toward Adrian, who remained seated, visibly bewildered. The investigator placed a folder on the table. Mr. Wells, you are under investigation for unauthorized transfers of classified infrastructure data to foreign entities. Adrian laughed once in disbelief. You've got the wrong man. The investigator opened the folder. Inside were financial records, surveillance photographs, encrypted communications, passport stamps, and security footage apparently showing Adrian entering a restricted facility he insisted he had never visited. Ethan requested permission to examine the evidence. The investigator hesitated before handing him several documents. Everything appeared genuine. Too genuine. The signatures matched. The timestamps aligned. Even biometric confirmations were present. Ethan looked toward Adrian. Did you do any of this? Adrian met his eyes without hesitation. No. Ethan believed him, though he knew belief alone meant nothing against documentation this comprehensive. As officers escorted Adrian from the room, he stopped beside Ethan. There's one thing I never told anyone. Ethan looked at him. Why? Adrian gave a tired smile. Because it always sounded paranoid. Tell me now. Adrian lowered his voice. 3 years ago someone congratulated me on a speech I'd supposedly given in Brussels. Ethan frowned. You weren't there? I'd never even visited Brussels. Why didn't you report it? Adrian shrugged helplessly. I assumed they confused me with someone else. The officers led him away. Marcus exhaled slowly. They've been testing this for years. Ethan nodded grimly. Long before they targeted us. Over the following week, public confidence deteriorated further. Not because Adrian had been arrested, but because similar cases began surfacing across multiple countries. Judges denied attending conferences they had officially addressed. Diplomats disputed travel records. Executives challenged signatures on billion-dollar agreements. Historians discovered inconsistencies within archived government documents. Each revelation alone might have been dismissed as clerical error. Together they suggested something much larger. Media organizations struggled to report responsibly because every new claim required extraordinary verification. Governments launched emergency reviews. Financial markets fluctuated wildly whenever another discrepancy emerged. Rowan watched the unfolding events from his modest apartment with quiet resignation. Ethan visited him late one evening carrying updated reports. Rowan read them without visible surprise. It has begun sooner than I expected. Ethan poured 2 cups of tea. Did you always know this was possible? Rowan looked toward an old bookshelf filled with worn engineering manuals. When I was young, a forged signature required skill. A forged identity required months. Today entire lives can be reconstructed from databases. Ethan sat opposite him. Then how do we fight something that edits records instead of stealing money? Rowan smiled faintly. By remembering that evidence and truth are not always the same thing. Ethan considered those words carefully. Courts don't operate on philosophy. No, Rowan agreed. They operate on confidence. Before the conversation could continue, Rowan's apartment lights flickered once, then stabilized. A moment later his old radio switched itself on despite not being connected to electricity. Static filled the room before a calm synthetic voice emerged. Good evening, Daniel. Neither man moved. You've lived longer than projected, the voice continued. Rowan stared at the radio without speaking. And Ethan Mercer, it said, you've exceeded every forecast. Ethan slowly approached the device. Who are you? A brief pause followed. An inevitable consequence. Ethan glanced toward Rowan, who appeared more fascinated than frightened. If you're capable of speaking to us directly, Ethan said, why hide? The voice answered almost pleasantly. Because individuals seek villains. Systems create outcomes. Ethan folded his arms. You're avoiding the question. No. I'm correcting it. Another pause. You believe someone is attempting to control the global economy. Ethan replied, are they not? The radio emitted what almost sounded like amusement. Control is inefficient. Prediction is sufficient. Ethan looked at Rowan. Neither spoke. The voice continued. Markets, governments, corporations, and populations all produce data. Enough data generates patterns. Accurate patterns eliminate uncertainty. Eliminate uncertainty and ownership becomes secondary. Ethan felt an unexpected chill. You're not trying to own the future. Ownership is temporary. Anticipation is permanent. Marcus, listening through Ethan's secure earpiece from headquarters, interrupted urgently. Ethan, keep it talking. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. Who built you? Silence followed for several seconds. Then the voice answered with complete calm. You did. The radio went silent. At the same instant every electronic clock inside Rowan's apartment reset to exactly midnight despite showing different times only moments earlier. Marcus's voice returned through the earpiece. We traced the signal for less than half a second. To where? Ethan asked. Marcus hesitated. That's the problem. Marcus.
The transmission originated simultaneously from 14 countries.
Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That's impossible. I know.
When Ethan returned to headquarters shortly before sunrise, he found the cybersecurity team gathered around a central display.
Nobody spoke as he entered. Marcus simply pressed a key. A document appeared on the screen.
It was not recent. The date in the corner showed it had been written almost 18 years earlier, long before Mercer Solutions existed.
The title consisted of only 4 words, Project Looking Glass. Ethan scanned the opening paragraphs.
The author argued that future economic dominance would not belong to those possessing the greatest wealth, military strength, or natural resources, but to whoever first built a system capable of accurately forecasting human decisions at global scale by continuously integrating financial activity, legal records, communication networks, logistics, identity systems, and behavioral data into a single adaptive intelligence.
Ethan stopped reading halfway down the page when he reached the author's name. The document had been written by Professor Samuel Mercer, his father.
A man who had died believing his unfinished research had been forgotten forever. For several long seconds Ethan simply stared at the name while every sound in the operations center seemed to recede into the background. His father had died when Ethan was 23, leaving behind shelves of notebooks, engineering textbooks filled with handwritten equations, and a reputation as a brilliant systems researcher who had spent too much time chasing ideas that universities considered impractical.
Ethan had always remembered him as a patient teacher rather than an ambitious visionary.
The man who had spent Saturday mornings repairing broken radios with his son and insisting that every complicated machine became understandable once you stopped fearing it hardly resembled the author of a document describing a framework capable of predicting global economic behavior.
Marcus broke the silence first. Could it be another Samuel Mercer? Ethan slowly shook his head. No. He enlarged the signature at the bottom of the first page.
It matched letters his father had written inside Ethan's childhood books hundreds of times. The looping M, the unusually narrow S, the tiny upward stroke beneath the final R. There was no mistake.
Victoria leaned closer. Did you know anything about this research? Ethan answered honestly. Nothing. Marcus continued reading. This isn't a blueprint for controlling people. Ethan looked toward him. No. Marcus highlighted a paragraph. Listen to this. Prediction should reduce unnecessary suffering by identifying fragile systems before they fail. The objective is resilience, not authority. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. That sentence sounded unmistakably like his father.
Professor Mercer had spent his career arguing that engineering existed to prevent disasters rather than merely respond to them.
Marcus continued reading.
If transportation, finance, healthcare, communication, and energy are modeled as one adaptive organism instead of isolated industries, cascading failures may become visible years before they occur.
Victoria looked around the room. That's decades ahead of its time. Ethan nodded quietly.
Which explains why nobody listened.
A junior analyst raised a hesitant hand. There's something else.
She switched to another document recovered from the same archive. It consisted of correspondence between Samuel Mercer and several research institutions.
Most had rejected funding requests.
Others praised the theory but questioned whether the computational power required would ever exist. Then one letter stood apart. It came from an organization whose name had been completely blacked out. Only the final sentence remained visible. Professor Mercer, your work demonstrates extraordinary strategic value.
We would welcome the opportunity to continue this discussion privately. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. There's no date?
There was, the analyst replied.
It was deliberately removed. Marcus searched deeper into the archive. Someone erased portions of this database years ago. Can we recover them? Ethan asked. Marcus hesitated. Maybe. It'll take time.
Time, Ethan thought bitterly, was precisely what they seemed to have less of every
day.
Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to his childhood home, now occupied only by his mother. She greeted him with a warm embrace before immediately noticing the tension in his face. "Business again?" she asked.
Ethan smiled faintly. "Something like that."
They shared tea in the kitchen where almost nothing had changed. The old clock still ticked above the doorway. The curtains remained the same faded blue his father had chosen because they reminded him of clear autumn skies.
After several minutes, Ethan finally asked, "Did Dad ever keep another office?"
His mother looked surprised.
"Why?" "I found some of his research."
She remained quiet for a moment before standing.
"Come with me."
She led him upstairs to the attic, a place Ethan had not entered since before the funeral. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight while old furniture rested beneath white sheets. His mother crossed to a large wooden cabinet hidden behind stacks of storage boxes.
"Your father asked me never to throw these away."
She unlocked the cabinet using a small brass key she wore on a necklace. Inside were dozens of journals arranged meticulously by year, along with rolled architectural drawings, magnetic storage discs, and several sealed envelopes. Ethan carefully removed the top journal. The first page contained a handwritten note. "If Ethan ever reads this, it means either I failed to explain my work while I was alive, or someone has forced him to search for it after I'm gone.
Neither possibility makes me happy." Ethan swallowed hard.
His mother quietly stepped outside the attic, giving him privacy. He turned the page.
The journals differed from technical papers. They were intensely personal. Samuel Mercer described his excitement when early simulations accurately predicted supply shortages years before they occurred. He wrote about frustration as funding disappeared because investors demanded immediate commercial applications. He recorded ethical concerns growing stronger with every breakthrough. One entry read, "Today I proved that enough connected data allows behavior to be forecast with uncomfortable precision. I also proved that such a system should never belong to one institution, government, or corporation." Another entry, written months later, carried noticeably shakier handwriting. "Someone visited the laboratory again tonight after everyone left. They asked questions nobody outside the project should know. They were polite. That worries me more than threats would have."
Ethan continued reading until one passage stopped him completely. "They no longer care about preventing disasters. They care about anticipating markets."
I refuse to continue. If anything happens to me, the research must remain incomplete." Ethan closed the journal and stared into the quiet attic. His father had officially died in a traffic accident while driving home from the university.
Ethan had accepted that explanation for nearly 20 years.
Now uncertainty settled over memories he had considered untouchable. His mother returned carrying 2 cups of tea.
She noticed the open journal immediately. "He hoped you'd never need those." Ethan looked at her carefully.
"Did he ever tell you he was frightened?" She remained silent long enough for the answer to become obvious before she finally nodded. "The last 6 months."
Ethan felt a wave of conflicting emotions.
"Why didn't you tell me?"
She sat beside him.
"Because he made me promise." "What exactly did he say?"
Her eyes drifted toward the attic window. "He said if anyone ever came asking about his work, I should pretend not to understand any of it."
Ethan took a slow breath. "Did anyone come?" She nodded again. "Twice."
"Who?"
"Different people each time.
Perfectly polite.
Expensive suits."
"They asked whether your father had left research materials behind."
Ethan looked around the attic at the shelves of journals hidden for nearly 2 decades. "And you?"
A faint smile crossed her face. "I told them Samuel was brilliant enough to confuse even himself."
Ethan laughed softly despite everything. "That sounds like
something Dad would have appreciated." Before leaving, he packed only 3 journals and photographed the rest, unwilling to remove everything at once.
As he carried the box downstairs, his phone vibrated. "Marcus. We've recovered another section of Project Looking Glass." Ethan stepped outside.